Daniel's journey. From struggle to strength, Daniel sat at the small desk in his room, staring at the blank page in front of him. The quiet of the evening was the only time he felt truly at peace. In his house, silence was rare. His family was always loud, always demanding, and always critical. For as long as he could remember, Daniel had been the quiet one, the introvert who preferred reading a good book to attending social events. But in a family that thrived on noise and constant interaction, his quiet nature made him a target. Daniel's father, Greg, was a man who believed that strength meant being loud and assertive. He was the kind of person who took over every conversation and expected others to agree with him. "Daniel, you'll never get anywhere in life if you keep hiding in that room of yours," his father often said. Greg saw Daniel's introversion as a weakness, something that needed to be fixed. Daniel's mother, Linda, wasn't much different. She didn't understand why her son wasn't more outgoing like his siblings, Sarah and Jake. Sarah was the life of every party, and Jake was a natural leader, popular among his friends. They were everything Daniel wasn't, and his mother reminded him of this constantly. "Why don't you go out with your brother and sister more? You're too quiet, Daniel. People are going to think something's wrong with you." His siblings echoed these sentiments. Sarah would laugh and call him boring whenever he declined an invitation to one of her social events. Jake, always the jokester, often made fun of Daniel in front of others. "Don't mind Daniel," he would say. "He's just allergic to fun." Living in this environment was draining for Daniel. Every day felt like a test of endurance. He tried to keep his head down and avoid confrontation, but the constant criticism ate away at his confidence. The house was always filled with noise, arguments, laughter, or TV blaring, and Daniel longed for peace. But even in the rare quiet moments, the voices of his family echoed in his mind, telling him that he wasn't good enough, that he was strange for preferring his own company to theirs. School wasn't much better. Daniel struggled to make friends, not because he didn't want them, but because his introverted nature made it hard to connect with people in the loud, fast-paced environment. While other students seemed to thrive in group settings, Daniel felt overwhelmed. He often found himself sitting alone at lunch, not because he wanted to, but because he didn't know how to fit in with the others. His quiet demeanor was misunderstood, and his classmates saw him as distant or uninterested. At home, his isolation was even more painful. His family, instead of trying to understand him, treated his need for solitude as something unnatural. Whenever he retreated to his room to recharge after a long day, his family would knock on his door, demanding that he join them. "Why are you always hiding in here?" his father would ask. "You should be out there with us, being part of the family." The truth was, Daniel wasn't hiding. He was surviving. His room was his only refuge from the overwhelming energy of his family, but even that wasn't always enough to protect him. The constant pressure to be something he wasn't wore him down. He began to believe that maybe his family was right, maybe there was something wrong with him. Daniel's internal struggle grew worse over time. He felt trapped, like he was living someone else's life, forced to conform to the expectations of a family that didn't understand him. The more his family pushed him to be more like them, the more he retreated into himself. He felt invisible, like his true self was buried under layers of self-doubt and anxiety. One night, after a particularly heated argument with his father about his lack of social life, Daniel reached his breaking point. He locked himself in his room, feeling the familiar tightness in his chest that signaled another panic attack. The weight of his family's expectations felt suffocating, and for the first time in his life, he allowed himself to cry. The tears came slowly at first, then in waves, as years of frustration and sadness poured out of him. In the midst of his breakdown, Daniel realized something important. He couldn't continue living like this. He couldn't keep letting his family's toxic behavior define him. He needed to find a way to reclaim his sense of self, to learn to value his own needs and desires, even if his family never would. It wasn't an easy decision, but Daniel began to take small steps towards self-improvement. He turned to books, his longtime companions, for guidance. This time, though, he wasn't reading fiction. He started exploring self-help and psychology books, searching for answers to the questions that had been haunting him. Why did he feel so out of place in his own family? Why did their words hurt so much? And most importantly, how could he learn to stand up for himself? Through his reading, Daniel discovered the concept of boundaries. He learned that it was okay to say no, that his need for solitude wasn't a flaw, but a legitimate part of who he was. He also learned about toxic relationships and how sometimes the people closest to you can cause the most harm, even if they don't mean to. These realizations were a turning point for Daniel. For the first time in his life, he began to see his introversion not as a weakness, but as a strength. Armed with this new knowledge, Daniel slowly began to assert himself. The next time his father made a comment about him being too quiet, Daniel calmly replied, "Being quiet doesn't mean I'm weak. It's just who I am, and that's okay." His father was taken aback, and while he didn't respond positively right away, the fact that Daniel had spoken up at all was a victory in itself. Over time, Daniel continued to set boundaries with his family. When Sarah invited him to another loud party, he politely declined, explaining that he needed time to recharge. When Jake made a joke at his expense, Daniel didn't laugh along, but instead calmly told him that his jokes were hurtful. These small acts of self-assertion were difficult at first, but each one helped Daniel grow stronger. Eventually, Daniel realized that in order to fully thrive, he needed to create more distance between himself and his toxic family. He began saving money from his part-time job with the goal of moving out and creating a space where he could live authentically, without the constant pressure to conform to others' expectations. It took time, but after months of careful planning, Daniel was able to move into his own apartment. The first night in his new home was surreal. For the first time in his life, he was surrounded by silence, not the tense, uncomfortable silence of his family's house, but a peaceful, comforting stillness. He felt a weight lift off his shoulders as he sat on his small couch, taking in the calmness of his new space. This was his sanctuary, a place where he could finally be himself without fear of judgment. In the months that followed, Daniel flourished. He continued reading and learning, diving deeper into topics like mindfulness and self-care. He also began seeking out like-minded people, joining online communities for introverts, and attending small, quiet meetups where he could connect with others who understood him. Slowly but surely, Daniel built a new support system, one that celebrated his introversion rather than criticizing it. His success wasn't loud or flashy, but it was real. He didn't become the life of the party or a charismatic leader like his siblings, but he found something far more valuable: peace. Daniel had learned to embrace who he was, to honor his own needs, and to build a life that reflected his true self. One evening, as he sat reading in his quiet apartment, Daniel thought back to the years he had spent struggling under the weight of his family's expectations. He realized that their opinions no longer held power over him. He had found his own voice, his own path, and he was finally free. The next time he visited his family, things were different. They still made their usual comments, but Daniel no longer felt the sting of their words. He smiled politely, knowing that he didn't need their approval anymore. He had found something much more important: self-acceptance. Daniel's journey wasn't easy, but it had taught him one of life's most valuable lessons. True strength doesn't come from changing who you are to fit others' expectations. It comes from accepting yourself fully and unapologetically, and building a life that honors that truth. And for Daniel, that was the greatest success of all.